We should be live. Hello, class. This is very strange. We're going to do our best doing this. Fortunately, it's a lecture series, so I'm pretty good at just talking. But now Adam is double-checking that I'm live. Theoretically, you should all be able to see, and you should be able to type questions and comments, and Adam over here in the corner will be able to ask them.
Best.
He will do his best. If for some reason it cuts out on you or things like that, we will post this on YouTube as we've been doing. But theoretically, we're going to be going through your questions about character. And I'm just going to launch into that, and we'll just go from the questions from here for a while, and then we'll try to get to some of your questions that you can type in. Reminder, fill out the sheet that is your attendance sheet, the little questionnaire, to make sure that we know that you were virtually here. So, question number 1. How can you use pity to help readers connect with a character who has a tragic past without making them too incompetent or annoying? This is actually a really great question. So, couple pieces of advice here. Now, if it's tragic backstory, the thing you generally want to avoid is having the character themselves ruminate on it too much. Now, we talked about introspection, navel-gazing. You will do some of this. Good suggestion is often to have something remind the character of the thing they've lost, and then have them have a spike of pain and move beyond it. People who move beyond their pain are going to be innately more sympathetic than people who ruminate on it. This is difficult because it's very natural for a person to actually think about their pain, and we don't want to minimalize the pain or the tragedy that people go through. At the same time, just having people be one note and focus on it all the time is going to make people annoyed. So, multiple notes, have them have multiple emotional reactions. Try to have them not bemoan their situation too much, and maybe have other people bemoan it. Show them trying hard to succeed and failing anyway, particularly through reasons outside their control, and you will be able to build that sympathy for a character who is failing or who has lots of tragedy in their life. If you're worried, something I should mention here is that there's a trope called women in refrigerators that I would recommend you read. There is a theme in storytelling where a person uses a character who has not got a lot of influence or power over the story, usually the girlfriend of a superhero, which is where this trope originated. So read about the whole women in refrigerators trope. It is a troubling theme that writers tend to take people with no autonomy over the story and kill them as a way of building sympathy for the character who does have autonomy over the story. And what this tends to do is treat a lot of characters, particularly the women in the stories, as having no control over their lives and treating them as objects who exist only to further the motivations of the protagonist. This is dangerous trope to fall into because it leads you into all kinds of difficult situations where you are both making your characters not feel realistic, you are removing autonomy from a large number of your characters, and you're falling into a cliched trope. At the same time, you do want your protagonist to care about the people in their lives who are generally, if you're writing fantasy, science fiction type things, going to have less power over their situation. So it's not an easy never kill people in your books, but it's also be careful when you're doing this to make sure that they are full and developed characters who have autonomy in their lives, and ask yourself if you're falling into the tropes a little too much. What comes first, the characters, the plot? What generally changes more during the writing process? I would say for me, it's about even, but characters do change more during the writing process. They change the plot rather than the plot changing the characters, for me, most of the time. Does being a teacher at BYU who agrees to live the honor code ever affect anything that you write or how you write? This is a very BYU-centric thing. For people who don't know, BYU is a religious college, which means it has certain rules that people follow who are faculty or who are students. This has generally never affected what I write. my membership in the church, my personal morals and philosophy do affect what I write. But the honor code is just something I barely have ever thought about. So no, but the fundamentals that make me who I am certainly do influence what I write. How does writing graphic novels differ from writing novels, especially concerning character growth? Ask a graphic novel writer. Ask me maybe in a few years after I've done it more. I can't give you the answers there, and it would be disingenuous of me to try to talk too much about that for you. What motivates you to sit down and work out how to plan plot progression and character progression to work together? Not sure if motivates is the right term here, right? I am motivated by the same thing basically every day, which is that I want to tell my stories. Getting them out of my head onto the page that people can experience is the thing that I love to do. It is what drives me every day. Now, that's my motivation, my large-scale motivation. Get these stories out of my head onto the page. Let people experience the things that I have dreamed and imagined. What makes me work every day, like my small-scale motivation, my daily motivation, is watching that number count up toward being complete as I finish more and more chapters like I've talked about. I do really love it when plot and character mesh together. And oftentimes, it's a little bit of a revision process to make sure that alignment is working. In Rhythm of War, which I'm writing right now, I had a character that the plot all worked, but I felt like there wasn't the right character beat, and the third revision finally kind of made me find a character beat that worked for this character. And in this case, I changed the character's journey a little bit so that it dovetailed into the plot in a better way. And it feels really satisfying when you find that. But yeah, how much time do I need to devote to a secondary character to make people care? There is no set limit. This is a good question. You can, or I say some writers, some filmmakers can make you care about a person with just a short and brief scene. I've found myself in films caring for a character who doesn't even have a line of dialogue if this person is presented very accurately. I remember, for instance, that in the comic books, again, in the Death of Superman storylines, after Superman died back in the 90s, there are a lot of people who tried to take up his mantle, and the one I remember the most is the one who had the least screen time. It was a guy who had a hot dog cart and started giving away free hot dogs while wearing a Superman shirt. Because, like, this is how I'm going to be Superman. And that just stuck with me, right? That's a character who I think had, like, 3 panels or something like that. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but doing something very brief to add a lot of rooting interest for a character can make a secondary character very powerful to us in a very short amount of time. What does it mean exactly when you say add a viewpoint? This is in context of I believe where I was saying if you need to lengthen your story, you add a viewpoint. What I mean by this is a viewpoint character. Generally, in a book, the number of viewpoint characters you have is going to greatly influence how long your story is. A viewpoint character is a character through whose eyes we see. In a first-person story, this is going to be the I. You can have multiple eyes in a story. In a third limited, which is what I generally spend more of my time writing, this is just someone else's head that you're in. Now, I'll make the caveat here that occasionally writers, myself included, like to jump to one person's viewpoint for a short period of time, one chapter. And you're not going to get a lot of characters or a lot of viewpoints through their eyes. Usually this is to add flavor to the world or to show a plot point you can't normally show, or to just show a scene from someone else's perspective while all the other characters are there, just so you can do something new with it. But each time you get through into someone's eyes, you're going to have to start establishing rooting interest or sympathy or, antipathy if you're antipathy. I'm not even sure how to say that word. You're going to want to establish this character in the reader's eyes, and that's going to take some extra words than using a character you've already used. You're going to have to establish the way that they think about the world, which is going to use extra words. And if you actually want this to be a solid viewpoint character, you're going to want to create an arc for them either an internal arc or an external arc or multiples of each, and you're going to want to have a sequence of viewpoints that shows them working toward their goals or in other ways changing, which just adds another parallel dimension to your story. You can imagine this if you were watching a movie that was about teenagers going to school and about a young woman who is trying to join a sports team, and her arc is this whole get in onto the sports team, get onto the soccer team, how that would be a story. If you are going to add a viewpoint, you perhaps add the coach's viewpoint, and you're showing the coach's home life and all the things that are going on in her life and how things are difficult for her and how, all of this. And suddenly you've got a second storyline that then needs to dovetail into the first storyline in some way by the ending to make it feel cohesive. And you can see that that just adds a lot of extra work, but also it adds a lot of extra depth and changes your story dramatically. Now, if instead of showing the coach's story, you were showing the team captain's story, and this team captain has a different story, it changes your book in a different direction. So adding viewpoints is one of the ways that you sculpt the story in the way you're doing it. How do I keep character development happening at a steady rate instead of too much at once or not fast enough? This is practicing with your beta readers and your alpha readers. This is not one of those things that I can give you a formula for very easily. This is one where you're going to just have to look at it. You're going to have to try it. You're going to have to see what works for you. Generally, you're going to want every scene with that character to either keep establishing, their motivations, or to show them changing in some way. Ideally, every scene shows something like this. They make a step forward or backward, both in their emotional plot, their internal plot, in their relationships, or their external plot in some way, and also is helping ground their motivation even further. And doing that in every scene if you can. And watch what readers say. Watch what readers talk about. This is where your pacing comes in. How quickly are you moving us through the progress towards your promise is what pacing means, or at least one of the definitions of pacing. How do you write characters that have mental illnesses that you don't know much about? You come to know about them. I highly recommend for topics such as this that, so what are topics such as this? These are topics that if you do them poorly in your book, you can do damage to a group of people. For instance, by inaccurately representing mental health issues, you can, in your book, help to isolate people. You can make people feel worse, or you can sway the public opinion in ways that are harmful. Because of this is one of those issues that you should be really careful about. I don't think you should avoid doing it. This is where maybe I differ in opinion from some others who have legitimate suggestions that you just not write about things that you don't have personal experience in. For me, writing is about exploring the world and the human condition. And for me to do that in a way that is in any way satisfying to me, I have to have every character explore being something or someone different from how I am. And this is just part of my writing foundation. And so because of that, I'm going to get some things wrong, and you're going to get some things wrong, and you are going to accidentally do damage. So be aware of that. Do your best to avoid it by doing your research, going to primary sources and asking them, reading their blogs, reading their biographies, reading about them, the things that they write about their life in any of these sort of situations. And then make sure you get some people from that group to read your story. Pay them if they are an expert, or in other ways, try to get people to read your stories and give you feedback so that you can know. This is just something I feel that if you're going to approach these issues, you take upon yourself as a burden, as a writer, that is part of your responsibility. How do you keep character voices different from each other? How do you make distinct characters? We talked a lot about this last week, and so I'm not sure if we need to delve into this again, but I would say that remember motivations, mixed with characters' background influencing their view of the world, mixed with their individual voice, their personality coming through in the way they describe the world. That's going to get work. But last week's lecture covered this, and this is a question from 2 weeks ago. So let's see. Oh, here's a great question. How do you kill characters? So it's kind of an interesting thing for me because I often take a little more of a philosophical approach to this one. A lot of writers you'll talk to, they say, my characters live and I just let them do what they're doing. And when I first started writing, I thought this was complete bunk. I'm like, no, the characters do what I write for them to do. I'm a novelist, this is what I do. But at the same time, I can understand that, particularly in characters taking great risks. I, as a writer, kind of view it as I am going to not withhold the consequences some of the times I will, of characters taking actions that could cause their deaths. And I feel like when a character death is a direct consequence of actions taken by them or other characters in the story, it is going to come across, it's going to work. Lots of times in life, stories or deaths are not direct consequences. They're often indirect consequences. In stories, those tend to be very unsatisfying. When you have a giant war epic and your protagonist general dies of dysentery on the battlefield, it's a very difficult story to write in a way that's going to be satisfying. That's a challenge if you want to do it, but most of the time, that character dying as a result of the decision they made to have a battlefield in a certain place, or as a decision another character made to betray that character or something like this, is going to be a more satisfying story to tell, because that's how we do storytelling. Now, you're going to have to decide how you want this death to work. What are you wanting the death to achieve? So it's a very different thing if a character fulfills their arc and in fulfilling their arc decides to take a risk or make a sacrifice and die because of that. That's a very different story. That's a very heroic story. It's a very kind of classical Hollywood story. A different sort of story is the character is about to complete their arc and die right before it. This is hugely unsatisfying, which is something you can use as a tool in your storytelling. I have done it before. George Martin is very, very good at this. This idea of leaving you hanging in a way that all of the characters are left hanging because they thought this character's arc should be completed and it didn't get completed. This is a very dangerous tool to use. Readers do not like running across this very often unless you've already established that this is a theme of your story and it becomes a plus instead of a minus. How else do you kill characters? Making it a direct consequence of the actions of the antagonist is always a great idea if you are going to be killing characters in your story. There are a lot of great ways to do this, however. You need to ask yourself, what result do I want to have? Why is this character death happening in my story? How can I make sure that it is not feeling tropey, but is feeling like the real death of a character that, and understand this is going to have real consequences on reader emotions, and what do I want it to do as a story piece? That is a difficult balance to walk, because on one hand, I'm telling you, make sure it doesn't feel like the author just playing with figures on a table and knocking one over. While on the other hand, I'm telling you, you are an author playing with figures on the table and deciding to knock one over. It's about the illusion. It's the illusion of this is all real. Don't let them see the author's hand. When they see the author's hand, then you have generally made a mistake.
Joey Frederickson asks for you to talk about software you use to keep everything straight. Software I use to keep everything straight?
Yeah. All right. So software I use to keep everything straight is WikidPad, which is an open source wiki software, which I recommend if you want to keep a wiki for yourself. There's, moderate documentation about it. I was able to figure it out, and I am not terribly techie, so I assume that you can figure it out as well. I use Microsoft Word for everything else, and I keep it on Dropbox. Those are really my tools. I generally need nothing else. I have not used Scrivener extensively. A lot of people swear by it, and they are people I trust, so I think it is probably a very good tool, but I have never used it. So, how do I know when my character is too competent with 7 O's? So, character competence becomes a problem when things are supposed to be difficult for that character and they aren't. Now, things not being difficult for the character doesn't have to be a problem, is the thing. This comes down to the tone of your story and what people are wanting to get out of your story. For instance, having a story that is a mystery where the detective is extremely competent and the fun of the story is watching the detective step through the discovery process is really fun. This is Sherlock Holmes, right? Why was Sherlock Holmes loved by everyone? Sherlock Holmes was incredibly competent, and you just got to watch him solve a problem through the course of that story. Now, if the story were more about Sherlock Holmes as a character, as a lot of the modern adaptations are, then the stories tend to focus on the areas of incompetence that Sherlock Holmes has while balancing it with competence. So for instance, if Sherlock Holmes were also emotionally very stable and great at relationships and had everything together in his life, then the modern adaptations would not be as interesting because they're expanding to other areas. They're not just about, can he solve this mystery? Modern adaptations tend to be about, can he solve this mystery while maintaining a relationship with Watson while his own life is falling apart because he's a sociopath, right? Or something like that. In this case, competence in one area is balanced by incompetence in another. If your character is competent in all areas, you can still have a story that's engaging. It's just a very different type of story. It's going to be, we're going to enjoy watching the character go through the motions. We are not going to connect or empathize with that character generally as much. But this can still work. You just have to decide what type of story you're telling. In general, most writers, myself included, would recommend balancing areas of competence with areas of incompetence to give yourself more tools to tell a more varied story, but it is not the only way to tell stories. Adam, do you have any questions for me?
No.
All right. How do you make an iconic villain terrifying instead of cliche? So, so how about this? A cliche is when a story is doing something that has been done so many times that the original purpose of the cliche has been lost and replaced with kind of the pop understanding, the collective understanding of it. For instance, the original purpose of a villain giving a monologue at the end of their story is to fill the reader in on details. Now, when a villain does that, a significant portion of the audience says, oh, they're monologuing again. That reminds me of that other story where they made jokes about that. Isn't that funny? And instead of paying attention to getting the information, the readers are instead remembering another story and getting the wrong mood applied to your story. That's why a villain monologue is generally a bad idea now. Now, of course, it was probably always a bit of a bad idea, but it's especially a bad idea because of the cliche. So if you're asking, how do I prevent a villain from being cliche? This becomes you asking yourself, all right, what has the cliche been replaced with? What was the original intent? What is now what's going on? If the villain is cliched, because a lot of villains these days, if you would say, why are they cliched? It is because they are one note, they want only one thing, they don't have a lot of time in the film you're watching for this villain to have multiple, character traits, so they focus on the one. They want some MacGuffin, whether it be a mother box or an infinity stone, and they are spending all of their time getting this thing and don't really explain why they want it except for nebulous power. This is generally the most cliched type of villain. That's pretty easy to undermine or to subvert by spending a little bit of time giving the villain interesting motivations for this thing. Spending all this work that we've talked about building characters devote it to your villain. It's going to take more time. Taking more time and more screen time on the page can be difficult, particularly if you don't have a viewpoint for your villain. But these are the sorts of things that you want to practice if you want to stop being cliche. And it in villains is particularly difficult because of a couple things. One is screen time. If you are not writing a lot of viewpoints from that character's eyes, it's going to be harder to give them motivations. But it's not impossible, particularly if you have one of your main characters spending a lot of time with this villain, and you present one motivation and then you add complexity to it with future scenes. Readers really like this. I, as a reader, love this when I'm presented as a villain that says, I need the MacGuffin. And you're like, oh great, this is what the villain does. And then the next scene, I need the MacGuffin because my family is being held and I can use it to get my family back. Suddenly more motivation. And the further you go with that villain, the more, of course, I did pick the most cliched way to give depth to a villain, but you see what I'm talking about here. More time, more diversity of this character's perspectives and opinions, and foundation of their motivation is just going to serve you very well in this regard. You make a villain not cliche in the same way you make any character not cliche. All right, I'm going to jump to some of the questions from last week. Let's see. These are not formatted quite as well. So
I do have some questions that came in. If you want to go, just let me know.
Okay, let me do a few of these. And then, how do I make two characters who have opposing goals equally sympathetic, especially when one of them is clearly on the road to villainy? So we talked a little about this right now. I want to dig into this idea just a little bit more and say putting them at contrasting goals is really, really handy. This is just a great way to make a villain, but you do ask the question of how can you make them both sympathetic? They should both want what they're going for and make the achieving of it mutually exclusive, meaning if one gets it, it's zero sum. The other one can't get it, and then you just show why they both want it, right? If you show their motivations, if you let us see why they need this thing, then it will work for itself. It'll work itself out if we understand their motivations, and their motivations are sympathetic motivations, meaning they're motivations that a normal person would have. One of the reasons that villains get cliched is this sort of, I want power, which is kind of nebulous. Like, yes, people want power, but really in our lives, what we want is, I want this promotion so that the work I'm doing, I'm respected for. Yes, getting the promotion does give you more power, but then there seem to be very few people who are just like, whoa, I want power. The more they're along the lines of, I could do this job so well if I just could cut through the red tape. If I can get to a higher level, if I can get this promotion, the red tape goes away and I can make it done the way I want it to be done, and that will be great because everything will run more smoothly. That is a realistic motivation as opposed to, I want the promotion for more power! Spend a little bit of time and ask yourself why a person would want to do this. Two characters going for the same promotion. One of them wants it because they feel like they can legitimately just make the world a better place, and the other one wants it because they need an expensive type of surgery that if they can't pay for, they will die. You have two contrasting motivations. Only one of them can have the promotion. Obviously, there are ways around this, but you see what I'm doing. Suddenly, we're sympathetic for both, but there's one that we want to succeed a little bit more. This is how you go about things. Let's see. How do you know which metaphors are appropriate when you're writing about a fantasy world that shares many elements of the real world? Oh, you've got a problem ahead of you here. Well, it's a problem in that I can offer you solutions, but you're going to have to make some difficult decisions. This is the translation problem, is what we call it. Basically, you're asking, when readers are reading my book, and you have your character put their feet up on an ottoman, do you call it an ottoman? When the Ottoman Empire never existed in this fantasy world, even though the fantasy world is very similar to Earth in a lot of other ways. You ask yourself, can you say it is the straw that broke the camel's back without people saying, wait a minute, that's a saying in our world. I know they have straw and camels in this world, but did they really come up with the exact same metaphor? It's even worse if there aren't camels, or you haven't introduced them that, and they're like, wait, are there camels in this world? I guess there must be, but that's just very, very weird to me. You have all kinds. You can go down a rabbit hole in this. For instance, in Mistborn, I use a lot of Greek and Latin word derivations in order to create the fantasy words that I'm using for the names of the magic systems, because in our world, we use a lot of Greek and Latin. So you end up with something like allomancy, which, mancy means to see the future. It also is a thing that sounds like a fantasy magic. And so when I use the word allomancy, am I saying that Latin exists in this world and that allomancy actually means what the Latin means? Or am I... you can go down a rabbit hole. You'll have to make your own decisions here on what you decide to do. I use something that Tolkien said, and I'm paraphrasing him horribly, but basically the idea was the books are translations from an original tongue, and the translator has interpreted sayings into things that a modern Western audience reading in English would understand. And so if Bilbo happens to say something that you're like, wait a minute, there's no Ottoman Empire, that is just the translator who is translating it into English and therefore using the word that is most similar. This is what I usually use as my excuse for this. It's being translated in English, and the translator is Brandon Sanderson, and he is going to use some terms from our world now and then. But even in saying that, you have to be careful, particularly in a fantasy work, with how much you kick the reader out. Yes, they can go through the thought process of that. The one that has kicked people out of the books the most is when I used the term homicidal hat trick for a character who had killed 3 members of another character's family. And I just love the term so much, I put it in, even though my editor's like, this will kick people out. And I'm like, yeah, but I like it. And then indeed, it is probably the phrase that has kicked people out the most, because they sit and they think, all right, hat trick means this. It's a sports term. Do they have sports on this world? What are they doing? Where'd they come up with this? That sort of thing. It has been, it's one of those things that even if you're in the right, there is no right. It's a fantasy novel, right? But even if you're in the right, there can be the question of, if you kick your audience out, or a significant portion, great, you're right, your story still works worse than if you were wrong. And so sometimes it's better just to trim these things out, but you're going to have to make that call yourself. Adam, let's get a question from the audience.
Okay. Shannon asks, how do you know you have the right character for the right plot in the early stages of telling a story or developing a story?
Right character for the right plot in the early stages of developing a story. Boy, I do a lot of this on instinct. I'll try to break it down for you. Generally, I am doing, in the early parts of my writing, some free writes from the characters' viewpoints. Sometimes these end up in the book, sometimes they don't. I posted for you the beginning of Skyward, where I did 3 different introductions to this character. And this was me searching to make sure I had the right character for this plot. Almost always, as a writer, you can make any plot interesting with any character with skill. It is very rare that I sit down and after writing for a while say, man, this is the wrong character for this plot. Because if you're doing your job right, then the plot is often catching people who are not well suited to the story that they're in and forcing them to go on the adventure anyway. That's what a lot of stories are about. You are a fish out of water. You are the person who has to save the world, but you don't fit that narrative. And as you write, who the character is will influence how they decide to go through this story. And if you're doing your characterization right, the reader will be like, yeah, this totally feels like how this character would go about saving the world. And that back and forth is what makes writing stories really fun and engaging. So I would worry about this less than you probably are, considering you're asking a question about it. That said, once in a while, a character doesn't fit. They are the wrong character. This happens when a character, for instance, is distracting from another plot. They are so, usually it's somebody who's very gregarious, right? Like their plot is super interesting, but it doesn't align with the main plot, and you bring them into the story, and suddenly every reader wants to read about this character instead. And they're not focusing on your main story. That's when you have decision points where you're like, maybe this character should have been the hero from the beginning. Or maybe this character needs their own story, and I need to put someone in that role who better folds into the group dynamic that I am creating for this ensemble cast. That definitely does happen now and then. But it's almost never do I think, oh, the character is the wrong character for the plot. The most I've ever done is do what I did in Way of Kings, where I split a character in half and made two different characters out of them, Dalinar and Adolin, as I've talked about before, so that I could split apart the motivations for the characters and the goals of the characters and have them in conflict with each other instead of the conflict internal in one character. So let me take another one of these. Oh, these are, yeah, this is harder because my TA didn't have time to get to it this time. So it's harder for me to, all right. Can you give us advice on how to submit to a publisher? Basically, normally I get all the questions separated from all the I likes, and now they're all together in one form. So I'm just going to have to scroll through. This will be next week. Next week, we will do a big rundown of all the publishers in science fiction and fantasy and some of the publishers in children's. We will talk about how to submit to them, and we will talk about publishing in traditional publishing sense. Theoretically, the next week, we will do some brief indie publishing sort of things. I have some students in the class who are successful full-time independent writers, and they've given me some notes. We were going to have them talk to you, but this whole format, we're going to use their notes instead, and I'm going to share some of those things with you and some of my own because I have done some indie publishing. So next week, we will dig into it, the big publishing lectures, and those are fire hose lectures, so I'm sorry about that. Let's see. Does every conversation need to be an info dump that's strictly centered around the plot? That's a good question, and the answer is obviously no. You're asking from the right place. Every conversation should do something. Hopefully every conversation does multiple things. That does not mean that they have to be an info dump, which is one of the things that conversations do, or advancing the plot. There are lots of other things that conversations do. For instance, some conversations in books exist solely to show that these two characters have a background together. This is when you have the character meet another character and they share a joke about Budapest, right? This happens in the Marvel films. You're like, these characters have banter, they have a history, they know each other and are friendly to each other, and go. It can be also conflict-driven, where these characters have not gotten along in the past. Dialogue can achieve that. Dialogue can be there just to make the reader laugh, or to make the reader cry, to inspire an emotion in a character. A lot of characterization, or a lot of dialogue in films is there to just be a joke. Now, this is often doing multiple things. It's making the reader laugh. It's often advancing the relationship of the characters, and it is often providing a break in the pacing of a tight action sequence or some other thing to give you a chance to feel another emotion for a while. Because one of the things you want to avoid in your stories generally is you want to avoid always being at a 10. This can be a big problem. I suppose I can write, because we did all this stuff on the board. If your story is always like, this is your character's emotional graph, right? And this is time, and this is how emotional they are on this topic. And your story is like this. This character is angry, and they are always at a 10. This is going to be bad for your story. This is going to lead to that one-note character problem that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It's going to lead to the reader feeling fatigued about this character and about the high emotions that are happening in it. You are also going to feel the story is stagnating because there is no motion. Now, of course, if this character is having a time where something makes them a little angry, but then they get over it, but then something worse happens, and they try to get over it, but then it spikes up, and then this is where, Hulk smash. Your story has motion. Your story has ups and downs. Your story is going to work better. This is the same sort of thing with action. If your story is at a 10 for action the entire time, you're going to have fatigue. In fact, it generally is even the same way for tension and pacing. Now, on pacing-wise, I will say that I have read shorter books that keep the pacing at a 9 or a 10 the entire book, and it works for me because I read it in one sitting, and then I'm done, and then I'm like, whew, that was a page-turner. Those books, if they ever get long enough that I have to put them down, at the end of it, I feel unsatisfied because I've been at a 10 or a 9 the whole time for, characters. This happens a lot in thrillers. Put it down, come back, and I'm like, oh, it's still at a 10. Right, this is getting old. This is just not working. So that's a matter of length of story. I often feel like I can keep the pacing as a writer faster and the emotion higher in a shorter work than I can in a longer work. In A Way of Kings book, I'm trying lots of ups and downs. I'm trying a steady ramp of a lot of these things, but then lulls where we have scenes where characters are just sitting around the fire chatting and having fun and remembering how much they enjoy being around each other to give us a relief from some of the moments of tension. Do you have another question for me?
There have been 3 questions about writing humor, specifically how to avoid becoming cliche or falling into the Jar Jar Binks type rabbit hole.
Right. Okay. All right. Let's talk about humor. I would recommend to you that you go to some humorists and listen to what they have to say. Howard Taylor, my friend and Writing Excuses co-host, talks about humor in excellent ways, and he is a better source than I am, though I do know enough about this to start talking about it a little bit. And so let's talk about humor. Humor works best either as a relief from some other tension, as a way of creating character familiarity or division between characters, or particularly humor works best when there's a lot of different types of humor. Humor is tough because humor is one of the most subjective things you will put in your book. What you find funny is going to often be more distinctive to you than what you find exciting. Generally, excitement and some of these emotions are more broad-based. Humor tends to be a little more individualized. And the other thing to remember about emotions, humor included, is the reader's investment in your story has a large effect on whether something feels melodramatic, meaning overly sentimental, or dramatic, just regular dramatic. You can see this by picking up a very dramatic story and reading only the ending. And when you don't have connection to the characters, it will feel way more sentimental to you a lot of times than if you are reading the book and it's a well-written book and you are getting to the end and you've been on the journey with these characters where you're like, wow, this emotion is earned. Therefore, I'm going to let myself feel it. Humor doesn't need to be earned as much as the other ones do. So let's talk about a few aspects of humor. So there are a couple of broad categories of humor you can use, and these tend to be good to add a variety of these, right? So one of the large categories is what we call the comic drop. The comic drop is where you are taking a person who is at a high level of respect, competence, self-respect, arrogance, you might say, and you are dropping them through a comment made by someone in the story or by a situation. If you've ever seen a story where someone talks, where a character's like, I am so great and awesome, I just succeeded. They didn't even say that. Like the character holds up the trophy that they have won, and then an egg hits them in the head, right? This is like complete undercut of the emotional moment by dropping that character from a place of security and strength to a place of being laughed at. And the comic drop is one of the more useful types of humor you can use. Understand, though, that if you drop somebody who's already low, that will actually drop the person making the joke more than it drops the person. This is what we call about punching up or punching down. When the person is standing on top of the podium and they have been victorious and they get an egg in the face, that is very different than the person who is walking away slumped because they didn't finish the race because, they tripped and fell and then someone throws an egg at them. That character is being dropped a little bit, but the person who threw the egg is the one who is really going to get our ire. So where you use your comic drops is one of the things that you can control. You can also show banter between characters. A lot of banters between characters involves a comic drop of some sort. It involves a character laughing at another character and then coming back with a nice comeback that drops them a little bit, but in a way that makes everybody smile, even the character smiling, so you the reader, can feel like you're in on the joke. You're all together. And you're having fun. When Lopen glues his face to the floor and everyone laughs, Lopen has dropped himself. This is one of the things Lopen does. This is why one of the reasons he's an endearing character is he's willing to drop himself and have fun with it and laugh at himself. And so in some ways, he's doing a comic drop, we are laughing at him, and we're liking him more in the same situation. Another sort of humor is the juxtaposition. So, things that don't belong together, juxtaposed, are often very funny. This is the source of humor in a lot of the movies that you'll see about, he is a strong, tough cop, and his companion is a 6-year-old with, in a Tinkerbell outfit or whatever. The idea of these two things alone are not necessarily funny, but these two things together make us laugh. Your comic juxtapositions, you do have to be careful about, because a lot of comic juxtapositions are going to, by their nature, make your story funny rather than making your characters funny. A comic drop is generally done by the characters or people in the story, and it's humor that's in the story. But for instance, that story I told you, you would not expect that to be a really tense drama about a character getting over, some difficult thing in their life. You'll probably add a little bit of that, but you'll understand that the reader is mostly going to laugh about these two paired characters who do not get along. The comic juxtaposition can just be used in joke form as well, but again, the more you use it, the more jokey it can make your entire story. Again, I am not an expert in this, and so a lot of things I'm going to be saying don't fit into the big theme. There are people who can talk about this thematically a lot better, but is the rule of 3. This goes along with juxtaposition, that a rule of 3, the idea for that, I should stand away from it so that you can actually see it on the board. The idea of rule of 3 is that when you show things happen in a sequence, you are going to be expecting some sort of tying together of these thematic elements and or some sort of reversal for the third one. And so, for instance, you can use the rule of 3 to have a list of things where the third one is a juxtaposition, or where the third one is a comic drop, or where the third one is something that is finally, the expected one. And an example of this, see if I can find an example. So, example of this, there is an old Bruce Willis movie that is really weird, called, The Hudson Hawk. So weird. They tried to do a comedic action thing, and they strayed a little bit too much into juxtaposition and comic drops on Bruce Willis's character to the point that nobody knew how to take it. It played a little bit like The Last Action Hero, if you've seen that, where I actually think Last Action Hero works really well, whereas Hudson Hawk is fascinating. But one of the running jokes in this is this idea that he wants a cup of coffee, right? And every time he goes to take a cup of get his drink of coffee, something happens to the coffee. And this kind of plays into a play on the rule of 3, and is repetition. Repetition, with some little variance in the repetition, is innately funny to us. So Bruce Willis goes to get a cup of coffee, and the first time something mundane stops him, right? I can't remember what it is in the story, so we'll just make up our own. The first time he gets his cup of coffee, he accidentally leaves it behind. The second time, it's a little sillier, right? He goes to get his cup of coffee, and this time someone else walks by and takes it and starts drinking it. The third time, you do something completely ridiculous. I do know this one is in the story. He picks up his cup of coffee and someone shoots the cup out of his hand and it explodes, right? And so because we've done the repetition, Bruce Willis can't have his coffee. And because we're seeing this idea of the rule of three, I don't think the coffee thing in that movie is actually rule of three. I think it goes far beyond that. But the idea is that escalation makes humor. The more you escalate this thing, the more interesting it becomes. And one thing to be aware of with humor is that you want to start small with this escalation for the same sort of reason that if it's always up here, it's always completely crazy, then you're not going to enjoy it as much as if it starts normal. A lot of times, if the situations are really crazy, at the end of the by the beginning of the story, your buy-in is much lower. But if it starts normal and then gets ridiculous, by the end you are buying into very, very insane situations. A lot of what we kind of call the comic farce, like the Chevy Chase vacation movies. The way these work is by starting with a small little thing that is going wrong, and then the character's bumbling inability to deal with it escalates the situation to something that seems normal, then just seems a little less normal, and then seems completely outlandish. But since each step is very small, we are laughing at how Chevy Chase is able to top how ridiculous the situation is each given time. So a couple of things to help you. I really would point you toward other humorists. Do realize that there are also kind of general themes of humor. There is what we would call, let me erase this guy, and I try to, in my books, have a little bit of each of these. So there's what we call character humor. Character humor is our humor that is often a character is just innately a little odd. This is Lopin glues his face to the floor. Lopin is really interested in using the magic to get women. Lopin is fun because he's got very relatable sort of issues. He wants to get women, but his way of doing it is they'll really like me if I can glue my friends to the wall. They'll think that's great. That is character humor. There is relationship humor. This is when two characters' quirks play off of it in a way that it exaggerates their quirks, that it juxtaposes their quirks, and in this type of relationship humor is just fun to watch. This is generally very good for building camaraderie between a team. This is where your banter comes in. There is a related one, which is the insult humor, where someone is dropping someone else and making you laugh at it. And then there is textual. These are dad jokes, right? These are your puns on the very nature of your standard jokey joke. I love these. I am a dad, so it makes sense. But generally, a good book, long book, is going to have a little bit of each of these going on in the story. And that variety makes sure that somebody's going to laugh. Or everyone's going to laugh at something in your story, even if they find some of the humor to be grating and not work on them. All right, what time are we at here? We've got 20 minutes left. So let's see. I had a good time in person for the first time. Well, I'm glad. Let's see. When is introspection good for characters? This is actually a great question. Introspection is one of those things that's generally good for all characters, but is generally you generally need much less of it than your instincts will want you to use. And so all characters need a little bit of introspection, I feel, unless you're writing in some interesting cinematic form where you're not being inside of anyone's heads. Every character is going to at some point think, man, that just sucked. I can't get over how much that thing that happened to me just sucked. By having them think about something like that, it just makes them feel like a real human being. Now, one of the things that you may run into is that some people, I am one of these, have a narrative in their head. They think to themselves. I think to myself, that just sucked, when something happens that sucked. Some people do not think like that. It's more of an emotion or impression to them. And so they aren't having a constant narrative of voice in their heads. And writing different characters in different ways like this could be something you could try. It's very difficult to do. Another question from over here.
Yeah, Liam wants you to talk about the Sanderlatch, specifically how you converge multiple plots and subplots without it feeling rushed, slow, or forgotten.
Okay, Sanderlatch. So how do you converge all of the different plots? So this is something I love in stories, if you can't tell from the way I write my stories. A spectacular ending where multiple plot threads come together at once. It's just, this is what I'm in it for, right? This is why I love it. Some tips. So early in my career, before I got published, I started using these Sanderlatches very naturally, and I found actually that it was easy to lose track of some of the smaller climactic moments when you are constantly one-upping them with multiple other moments. And so it became, one of the things I had to practice was learning which moments together in an avalanche could be not forgotten. And this is a matter of, if we kind of go back to what we were talking about before, this idea of making sure that everything's not at a 10 all the time. You can imagine your character emotions on this thing, and you have three characters who are all kind of, let's grab a couple different colors for this. You've got three characters, and they all have emotional journeys that, one looks like this, and the next one starts a little higher, but then falls and is not learning, but then, their emotions get high, and right at the end they spike. And then character 3 has a more gradual, sort of subtle, we're not doing, and then their arc is like that, and they go like this. Or actually, it would be, so they get to their height right here. All right, let's use that. You can see how, theoretically, this character's emotional moment and journey is going to completely be consumed by the fact that these very, very dramatic moments are happening, where you've brought multiple characters up to a 10, where the action perhaps is up at a 10, where things are exploding and things like that, while as another character is maybe realizing that all along their mother cared for them, and that's just a warm thing for them to come to understand. This character's arc is going to be better completed, as I originally drew it, over here, where you get to, while this character's arc is going down, have a little high for this character, where they come to their kind of realization, where they can shine a little bit on their own. Where these two, you're going to interweave because they're kind of both getting to the same heights at the same time, and so you want this to kind of be a 1-2 punch, where you're in one character's head and something is happening, and then what's happening to this character, if you can do it right, will relate to this character in some way, so that their plots are feeding off of each other, and you're feeling like they're part of one great whole where they're intersecting. This tends to work much better than having them separate. If you're going to have these separate, bringing this one to their climax here and this one to their climax there is generally going to be a better choice for you. Also remember, avoid having twists just to have twists. Early in my career, I cut this from Elantris, but I had one of the characters turn out to have, at the end of the book, a completely different heritage that he had been hiding the entire time from everyone else because I thought it was a cool twist. It added nothing to the book. In fact, it was like something went like this and then ramped all the way up to 10 because it's like, oh, this character came out of nowhere having a background similar to me, and it's really important, it's tying in, and it didn't actually. It meant nothing. It was just confusing, and the reader's like, wait, why I can't focus on these other twists because you have too many twists happening. Twists for twist's sake are generally not going to be as effective as making sure that it adds something to the character dynamic and that it reveals something about the plot and setting. So there are some tips for you.
Annie says, if a character is not going to get a happy ending, what promises do you give at the beginning of a story so that you don't give too much away, but also don't set the reader up to be dissatisfied?
So, this is an excellent question, because you can write a tragedy where a character does not get a happy ending and where you are left sad. That is kind of the point of a tragedy, is you did not get what you wanted to get. This can be very unsatisfying in a good way sometimes. That's what you tried to do. Most of the time, you want to give an indication that this is possible in the world. You do this by raising the question, right? If the character is you're having a classic tragedy, the character's flaw is going to prevent them from making the correct decision at the end of the story, or their flaw early on is going to snowball to cause them to have consequences. This is very easy to foreshadow because you are showing the same story you would as if they succeed with the same sort of foreshadowing, except at the end they make the wrong choice. And if it were tense in the book where they made the right choice, then your foreshadowing would have been in place that they could have potentially made the wrong choice. Now, I would generally recommend adding to this something else to balance it out. Generally, a character who makes a right choice as a contrast, or showing early in the story that this is a story that is a world full of tragedy, and you are watching to see that tragedy unfold by giving foreshadowing, by showing some characters have tragic ends earlier in the story. Another way that you can do this is, of course, the sort of good version of a bait and switch, where you give an early promise and then you show through the course of the story that the character doesn't deserve that at the end the reader is supposed to be rooting for them to not get the ending because they don't deserve it. They weren't worthy of it. Or flipping on their head, the thing that the character is told they're supposed to want, the character by the end of the story has realized that they don't want. And so therefore, when they don't get their happy ending, it's happy in a different way because that character has learned that they want something else more. This does happen a lot in again, if we go back to the classic Hollywood action ending, where what does the character want? They want to, to be in love and be with the person they love. But what do they need? They need to save the world so that person they love doesn't die. So in the end, this character makes a heroic sacrifice, does not get the happy ending to be with the character that they want to be with, but also at the same time has achieved the need that the world needed, which is saving the world. This is kind of a classic bittersweet ending for an action hero. So lots of different dynamics you can take here, lots of different directions you can take it. The tone of your story is going to influence this a great deal, but make sure that you're giving that promise that it could be a decision that the character might not get what they want, even in a story where they do.
Braden says, how do I know when an arc deserves multiple books, and how do I know when and where to break a story into multiple books?
Okay, great question. How do you know if a character's story is going to need multiple books, and how do you know where to break that story? So worrying about multiple books is one of these things that I find new authors do too much. Because in general, you will be better served as a new writer if you pretend you need to do the full arc for a character in a single volume and give your best and your all to it. Obviously, as experienced writers, and some of you are obviously already experienced writers or want to try something a little more difficult, know that characters having arcs across multiple books is also very important. One of my rules of thumb is make the first book as satisfying as you can. Make sure that there is a complete arc for a character. You generally do this if you're going to be splitting up your character's arc by splitting it up into multiple steps. For instance, we can go back to Star Wars, the prime example that I often use, the original trilogy, of course. In Star Wars, Luke has an arc in 3 parts. And we are presented only with the first version of his arc early in the story. The first version of his arc is he wants to go off into the stars and have an adventure. Then later on, when he makes Obi-Wan, Obi-Wan presents another step in that arc. You are going to have to learn to become a Jedi Master. And during the course of the story, the I go off into the stars and have an adventure goes through a complete arc, while the you have to go and become a Jedi goes to step number 1, learning to trust the Force. And if you were plotting this story ahead of time, you would say, okay, step number 1, learn to trust the Force. Step number 2, control your rage and your emotions. Step number 3, confront your father figure and redeem him instead of killing him. This is your journey as a Jedi. So movie 1, he learns to trust the Force. Movie 2, he has trouble trusting his emotions and fails at it. Movie 3, he has learned to master his emotion, goes to the end, proves this by redeeming his father instead of killing him. If you came up with that arc and you in the first one said, I'm going to make this first one learning to trust the Force, I'm going to give it its own full arc in the story. Luke is going to fail to trust the Force and get shot by the little thing flying around him. He's going to have a contrary opinion that says this is all bunk, you shouldn't listen to any of it. He's going to have a challenge at the end where he has to decide if he's listening to the guy who said blasters are really cool, don't listen to the Force, or his ghost dad who says listen to the Force, Luke. He's going to choose between those two, learn to trust the Force, and be rewarded by being able to make the shot that is impossible, that the targeting system has already shown that another character was not able to use to make the shot. So you have a full and complete arc of what is step 1. So if you get good at this, what you're going to decide you're going to do is you're going to say, can I make step 1 in this character's journey completely fulfilling in and of itself, using all the tools that a writer uses to make something fulfilling? If yes, do that arc and write that book and then take the next step in the next book. If you're worried about this though, a lot of times doing the full arc in a story for a character can be great practice. It can make for a stronger story. And afterward you can say, all right, the character is here in their life. Now, what other challenges can I give them now that they feel like they've mastered this one arc? How can I put a challenge in front of them that makes them uncertain that they can continue and persist in this? How can I make this character have to prove that they can hold on to and, do some enduring to the end sort of stuff? You can always, with a character, find something more to explore in them. Just do be aware that the longer your series becomes, the more difficult this becomes for the reader to continue suspending their disbelief that this character is going to go through 14 different arcs and 14 different stories. That is a real and difficult thing to deal with. But there are very few models of how to do this, and you're going to have to find your own way in doing it. So if you're planning a 14-book series, which right now I would say just write the first one the best you can, and then sit back and ask yourself, all right, can I now plot more books for this character where each one is going to be fulfilling, and I'll break it up.
Nathaniel says, how do you develop characters, heroes failing to villains, etc., off camera so that it's a surprise?
All right, how do you develop villains off camera?
Villains, characters.
That is a surprise? Okay. So you do need to do this once in a while. Develop characters off screen, off the page, so that when they show up, it's either a surprise or it's an interesting reveal. You don't have to do this often, but you do have to do it. What I think you're talking about is where, let's see if I can find a great example of this in cinema or something like that. There's an old movie called Mystery Men, where they talk about the coolest superhero who ever existed being this guy who can cut guns in half with his mind. And this character is not on stage until midway through the movie, where someone shows up and a bunch of guns get cut in half, and they're like, oh, it's the dude who can cut guns in half with his mind. That's so cool, because the rest of us have lame superpowers, and that one's actually useful. And it works very well as a reveal in that movie. This is, I think, the sort of thing you're talking about. You're developing a character by their lore. And this is generally what you're going to want to do, is you're going to want to have characters talk about this other character. You're going to want to have characters, this character has had an influence on the world that is plainly visible. And you do this with all the stuff that I've been talking about with other world-building elements. This person becomes a world-building element until they step onto the page and becomes a character. And at that moment, you're going to have to transition them out of legend and myth, which is going to be a little by nature tropey, and into person. And that transition is the hard thing. Building up the lore of them is not necessarily that difficult. Again, treat it like any sort of world-building element that you would use. Last question? Yeah.
Dave says, how do you balance that plot progression as seen on the graph with the impression of characters controlling their own destiny?
Oh, great question. So how do you do this graph while also making the characters have autonomy, right? And so that is really great. You are going to want to make sure that your characters are by this point. Like, what is this ramp up? This is generally the point where a crisis is happening for the character, and they are knowing they're going to have to make a decision. And this point should be a decision by the character, one way or the other. In here, you generally want to show them making small decisions along this way and either failing or succeeding and then bearing the consequences. For instance, if your arc is the character needs to be more brave, right? And needs to, grab the sword and charge the enemy army to inspire everyone else who's too afraid to do so to join in with them. So if you were going to do that, you would earlier want to give them a chance to make that decision and either fail or make it correctly and then have terrible consequences on it so the reader is uncertain if they'll make it again, this sort of thing. Having those decision points built along that where the character's actual actions change the plot and the course of the story, that needs to start happening way earlier in your story than your climax. And so the character failing to pick up the sword and go charging for whatever reason should have a consequence that the reader notices and feels as a consequence. The character has autonomy. It's just the sort of thing where you're like, man, this is a kick in the stomach. This sort of thing, giving your characters an influence over the plot, is really important, particularly after about the first third. Generally, in the first third, you can have the character be inactive. Some stories manage to make it go through 2/3. If you're doing this, make them have control over small aspects of their life, even if they can't have control of the large aspects of their life. The more and the sooner you can move the character into making decisions that are really relevant to the story, the better. This is generally something you want to do more of, not less. All right, guys, we will come back next week. Leave us some feedback if for some reason this didn't work digitally for you. And next week, we will talk about the business of writing. I'll have 2 fire hose ones for you where we talk about that, and then we'll do another Q&A to wrap it up on business. All right? Remember to take your tests or your quizzes. Thanks. Bye-bye.